Hey, Lions Nation! We're back with another exclusive video bringing you all the latest news about our beloved Detroit Lions. Before we get started, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss anything about the team now. Let's get into the news. No one in the NFL remembers silence like the silence that hit the league the moment ESPN pushed the alert. People talk about shocks, about unexpected trades, about blockbuster moves that twist the standings and rattle fan bases. But none of that compares to what detonated across the football world when the headline erupted. ESPN confirms Detroit Lions acquire Sauce Gardner in landscape-shifting trade. Phones didn't simply light up, they convulsed. Entire group chats froze as if the world momentarily forgot how to breathe. Analysts on live TV stared at their screens with expressions that looked almost staged, as if a producer had dared them not to blink, while the biggest defensive move in modern Lions history dropped onto their laps. But the shock wasn't in the words themselves. The shock was in the context. Sauce Gardner, All-Pro, franchise cornerstone, the lockdown artist of his generation, hadn't just been traded. He had been delivered to the last place anyone on earth wanted to see him go, into the hands of Dan Campbell, a man who had already turned Detroit from a moral victory story into a steel-toothed machine built to maul teams for 60 minutes straight. The tremor didn't stay in Detroit. It ran through the league like a pressure wave. Quarterbacks who once looked at Detroit's secondary as manageable suddenly felt their stomachs twist. Offensive coordinators began rewriting playbooks before sunrise, ripping pages out, scribbling new protections, circling Gardner's name 3 times in red, because this wasn't just any cornerback. This was the cornerback football's equivalent of a locked vault, a man who erased receivers without raising his voice, who carried himself like a shadow with pads, gliding with impossible calm while ripping dreams out of the air. And now he was a lion, no longer an opponent Detroit fans talked about with envy, no longer a problem belonging to someone else. He was theirs. He was wearing Honolulu blue. And perhaps the most disturbing part, something whispered in the hallways of Allen Park long before the trade leaked, was that Detroit had been preparing for this move longer than anyone realized. Campbell had once joked that he wanted a corner who could steal a man's hope with one look, and everyone thought it was just one of his usual war-paint phrases. Turns out, it was a prophecy. The public didn't know the half of it, not yet. Not when the breaking news banners were still screaming across the screen. Not when talking heads debated which draft picks, which players, which future pieces Detroit had sacrificed to pull off the impossible. What they didn't understand, what they wouldn't understand until much later, was that Detroit didn't sacrifice anything. They transformed. They shed a skin they'd outgrown. They took the risk willingly, with a grin, as if the front office had been waiting for this exact moment, for this exact fracture in the NFL hierarchy. And when the Jets hesitated, when internal disagreements, private tensions, and late-night phone calls cracked their foundation, Detroit struck, not with hesitation, not with fear, with precision, with the aggression of a franchise that had finally identified the missing piece in a puzzle that had been tormenting them for years. And that's why the league panicked, not because Detroit got a star. Stars move teams all the time. It happens every offseason. But a star like Sauce Gardner joining a coach like Campbell, that was something else entirely. It felt inevitable, like the league had been drifting toward this nightmare pairing for longer than anyone had acknowledged. And as the hours passed and more details trickled out, reports of Gardner calling Campbell personally, of private conversations about building something unbreakable, of the Lions promising him a defensive renaissance unlike anything he'd experienced before the narrative shifted. People stopped saying Detroit won the trade. They started saying Detroit changed permanently, irreversibly, and every rival team sensed it. The NFC North, once a division of comfortable rivalries and predictable storylines, suddenly found itself staring into a black-walled tunnel with no light at the end. Because whatever Gardner brought to Detroit's swagger, aggression, brilliance, it wasn't staying contained. It was going to bleed into everything, into the film sessions, into practices, into the culture, into the very identity of a team that already prided itself on playing at the edge of violence. By midnight, fans were flooding the streets around Ford Field, chanting Gardner's name like a sacred word. Some held homemade signs. Others held phones lighting up the winter sky. A few old-school fans simply stared at the stadium in disbelief, as if trying to convince themselves this wasn't a fever dream. Detroit had built something powerful, yes. But now, with Gardner, they had built something dangerous. Something that would make quarterbacks hesitate before releasing the ball. Something that would make receivers rethink crossing routes. Something that would make offensive coordinators wake up at 3 a.m. in cold sweats. Something that would remind the league that defense drew, smothering, soul-shaking defense wasn't dead, it had just moved to Michigan. Before we move on, take a second to drop a like and subscribe. That way, you'll stay up to date with every exclusive Lions update, and you'll even have a chance to win an official Detroit Lions jersey. Let's keep going, but the real story, the one that only emerged in scattered pieces from anonymous whispers and late-night messages, began long before the trade became public. It started in a room deep beneath Allen Park. A room few even knew existed, a place where the Lions held their most guarded internal meetings. There, under dim lights and walls lined with sound-dampening panels, the conversation took shape. Campbell sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Beside him, key members of Detroit's inner circle, figures who rarely appeared on television and whose names weren't printed on office doors. And what was discussed in that meeting wasn't just a transaction. It was a transformation. Campbell didn't want a cornerback. He wanted an anchor, a core, a gravitational pull strong enough to drag the entire defense into a new identity. And when someone at that table projected a film session of Gardner, blanketing elite receivers' routes disappearing, quarterbacks hesitating, air fizzing with panic, the room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like a verdict. Campbell leaned forward and said, only for words, "This is the one." From that moment forward, Detroit moved with an intention bordering on obsession. They mapped scenarios, built contingency plans, crafted negotiations so complex that even veteran executives would later admit they'd never seen anything like it. They analyzed locker room chemistry down to micro interactions. They studied Gardner's leadership style, his body language after big plays, even the subtle way he talked to teammates between snaps. They weren't searching for flaws. They were searching for alignment, for confirmation that he wasn't just a talent fit, but a cultural one, because Detroit wasn't interested in collecting stars. They were interested in building something that lasted, something that bent the league around it, the way great dynasties once did. And with Gardner, the Lions saw the chance to resurrect something the NFL hadn't felt in decades: fear of a secondary. When the trade became official, those who were in the room later admitted that it didn't feel like victory, it felt like ignition. Campbell didn't celebrate, he didn't cheer, he stood, he walked to the film screen, and with a simple click of the remote, he brought up Gardner highlights, the same tape that had originally silenced the room. But this time, something shifted. Watching those plays, knowing Gardner now belonged to Detroit, changed everything. Campbell didn't see clips anymore. He saw inevitabilities. He saw future Sundays where receivers vanished into Gardner's reach. He saw stadiums going mute as quarterbacks froze mid-throw. He saw Detroit rewriting not just their franchise history, but league history, and quietly, almost as an afterthought, he muttered a sentence that would later leak and echo across fan forums like a secret prophecy. "They're not scoring on us anymore." Outside Detroit, fear spread quickly. Rival executives scrambled to identify counter moves. Fans of other teams erupted into anger, disbelief, denial. Talking heads debated endlessly whether this marked the end of offensive-heavy dominance. Some called it reckless, some called it genius, some insisted Detroit had overpaid, grasping at narrative straws to avoid confronting what every defensive coordinator already knew deep in their bones. The Lions had just become the hardest team in the NFC to throw against. Gardner's presence alone shifted power dynamics. It forced defenses to play left-handed. It tilted the field before the ball was even snapped, and the Lions weren't done. That was perhaps the darkest, most unsettling truth buried beneath the headlines. This wasn't the final piece. This wasn't a last-ditch gamble. This was step one in a defensive metamorphosis that Campbell had been sketching in private for years, and with Gardner serving as the foundation, Detroit began treating their defensive scheme like a labyrinth, interlocking coverages, disguised pressures, traps set to lure quarterbacks into mistakes that would become viral highlights by Monday morning. Coaches from around the league began calling Gardner's arrival the beginning of something ugly. Ugly for everyone else. That is, as night gave way to morning, Detroit felt different. The air around Ford Field carried an edge, as if the city itself understood the magnitude of what had happened. The fans, the coaches, the players, they didn't just welcome Gardner, they absorbed him, his mentality, his ruthlessness, his quiet swagger. Detroit had been a team on the rise, But now they had a defender who didn't just shut down receivers, he shut down hope. He made quarterbacks reconsider their careers. He made coordinators rip up game plans and start from scratch. And that's when the league realized the truth they'd been avoiding. Detroit wasn't chasing anyone anymore. Detroit had become the team to chase, with Gardner sealing off one half of the field. The Lions' defense transformed from a respectable unit into a suffocating one, into a nightmare painted in blue and silver, into a system designed not to stop offenses, but to dismantle them, piece by piece, drive by drive, season by season. By sunrise, ESPN wasn't calling it a blockbuster trade anymore. They were calling it a shift in power. A defensive awakening, the rebirth of a franchise built to terrify opponents. And in every shadowed corner of the league, one question took root, growing darker by the hour. Echoing through meeting rooms and film sessions, we bring you the latest Lions news every single day, so make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing. And of course, drop a comment below with your thoughts on today's news. Your voice makes a difference for Lions Nation. See you in the next video.